Welcome to the Bold Lounge podcast. My name is Lee Burgess, and I will be your host. If you're anything like me, you love hearing inspiring stories of people who have gone on bold journeys and made a positive impact in the world. This podcast is all about those kinds of stories. Every week, we'll hear from someone who has taken the leap or embarked on an extraordinary journey. In addition to hearing their stories, we'll also learn about their bold growth mindset that they use to make things happen. Whether they faced challenges or doubts along the way, they persisted and ultimately achieved their goals. These impactful stories will leave you feeling motivated and inspired to pursue your own bold journey. I believe everyone has a bold story waiting to be freed. Tune in and get ready to be inspired. Welcome to the Bold Lounge. Today I have Amy Edmondson. She is the Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School. Edmondson has been recognized by the biannual Thinkers 50 Global Ranking of Management Thinkers since 2011, and most recently was ranked number 1 in 2021, and congratulations for 2023. She also received that organization's Breakthrough Idea Award in 2019 and the Talent Award in 2017. She studies teaming, psychological safety, and organizational learning, and her articles have been published in numerous academic and management outlets. Her latest book, The Right Kind of Wrong, which we're going to talk about today, built on her prior work on psychological safety and teaming to provide a framework for thinking about discussing and practicing the science of failing well. Welcome to the Bold Lounge, Jamie.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, we're going to start off by digging into some bold definitions. So what does bold look like in your world? What is your definition of bold?
Definition of bold is doing something that scares you a little, but that you believe to be on purpose, in support of your own purpose or growth.
Right. Okay. So not fearless, but stepping forward, even though you might have a little fear.
But it's in pursuit of something that matters.
I love that. Okay. So based on your definition, what's a moment of boldness that you remember?
You know, you mentioned books, so that got me thinking. I think a moment of boldness for me, and ultimately, looking back, it was career changing, was when I was 25 years old and decided, very boldly that I was going to write a book to clarify Buckminster Fuller's mathematical work for a lay audience, right? And I wasn't a writer. I was nobody. I had no reason to think that was something that I either could do or that anyone should want to read, but it seemed important enough to do. And I declared I was going to do it. And so then I was stuck.
Yeah, you kind of put it out in the universe and You couldn't go back, right?
Exactly.
That was a book taking very, very complex ideas, algorithms, calculations, math. I mean, whatever you define math as, and helping someone understand it at the layman's level. So when you jumped into that, what were some of the things that you had to do to actually take something so complex and simplify it? Because sometimes as leaders, we don't simplify, we actually complexify.
Right. I had to get a publisher. I had to sort of convince someone that this was a project they should support simultaneously. Really had to figure out, how was I going to do this? And the answer to how manifests itself as an outline, and ultimately an incredibly detailed outline, right? But by the time I was done outlining, it was probably 6 months of outlining. I didn't even really notice what I was doing, but I got so into the weeds. The outline was probably 15 pages long. And I finally realized what I was doing was procrastinating actually writing, because I was scared of writing.
Yeah. So when you're kind of going through that process, and you've written so many, several books since then, does it get easier when you're starting out? Obviously the type of book is different. And I'm writing my first book, and I'm just at the point where yesterday I handed in manuscript, which goes to the copy editor.
Great. Congratulations.
Yeah. So I'm excited about that, but it's like very, very unknown. How's it going to go? Are people going to like it? Is it going to resonate? And one of the things I kept doing was tweaking it and tuning it and tweaking it and tuning it. And I was just like, is it good enough? When you're writing a book, it's extremely vulnerable, right? At least it feels like that to me.
And it's never good enough.
Does it get easier?
Yes and no, right? So the good news is, like, writing a book for me is no longer new territory. And each new book is new territory. Mm-hmm. New territory is scary, and it's you don't know if it will work. And you don't know if you'll be able to conquer the uncertainty of the domain and saying something new in a way that is useful and compelling. And
Yeah.
it's a very hard thing to do. And when you say you just kept tweaking, that's what I do.
Yeah. The hardest part for me were the stories, even though like I can talk very easily the stories or examples, but it was hard to like put it down into writing. So kind of as you think about your own story, kind of starting off where you wrote this book at 25, which you knew it was needed, but you weren't sure who would receive it, who would support it, and you had to find a publisher to do that. Kind of moving forward, did that bold move lead to another bold move? How do you think that linked up to the next bold move?
Yes, well, it absolutely did, because first of all, I got away with it. I wrote and published the book. I'm not going to say it was a bestseller, because it never was, of course, but it did come out in 3 different editions. It is a kind of classic for its little niche audience. People cared about it. But I think the very boldness of it is probably the best legacy, because it gave me the experience, which you no doubt have had, that you go out on a limb and it works out okay. And it's like, well, I guess I should do that again. And I've gone on many, many limbs since that time. And most of the time the branches haven't cracked, and I've landed on my feet, sort of rewarded for the boldness of those moves, I guess. And it also did let me know at a deep level. I didn't write another book for many years, but it let me know I could do it. But more importantly, I think it gave me the sort of courage to keep going, the credibility that I could keep going. I suspect it played a crucial role in my being admitted to the PhD program in organizational behavior that I much later joined, because if nothing else, they had evidence that I could start something and finish it.
Mm-hmm. And you joined that program later in your selection. It wasn't your first selection, right? As kind of where you wanted to go.
Career-wise.
Yeah.
I started at 31.
So that's bold in itself, making that move.
Very. No, I mean, that was a very bold, because it's a real career shift. And it was, there was I had no background in my new field, really. No academic background, no psychology background, no business background. So I was going out on a limb to join a PhD program where others had far better preparation, with no certainty of even getting through it, let alone getting an actual academic job on the other end.
Yeah. And at Harvard.
Yeah.
So like not the easiest place for folks to get into, from that perspective. So, swinging for the fences, and you're in, and even though you're in and you're doing it, I think that's one of the things around being bold is like, we don't even realize like, wow, I got to keep going. Obviously I'm focused on what I'm doing and what's next, but that was a bold move to move into that new career path to get into Harvard. And I'm assuming there's still doubts that come up for someone, even though they're successful in everyone else's eyes.
Maybe it's time to say this, but being bold means, by definition, I think, accepting the very real possibility of failure, right? That if something is genuinely bold, it means it might succeed as you hope. It's on path, on purpose. But of course, it might not, right? It might not have been possible to write that book about Fuller's work. Might not have been possible to succeed in the PhD program, to get a job. And so probably the most recent being bold is writing this new book of Right Kind of Wrong, which is new in every way, but especially new as a trade book, as not just a management book, but a book for a broader audience. And I did not know for sure that I could write for that audience in a way that would be, meaningful and compelling. And that too could fall flat on its face. And the topic, I believed the topic of failure to be very, very important, but it could be a big yawn or a big...
It's sensitive. Like it could be a sensitive, especially in academia. Like it isn't something we're like, hey, we failed today at Duke or wherever you're working or at Harvard. Like But at the same time, I think it is celebrated in a way of like, hey, we learned that didn't work, so now we can go a different way. And I'm always, fail faster. That's even a book. But I mean, in the sense of how you figure things out. But one of the things you said in the book, which I underline as one of the statements I enjoyed, is if you are not failing, you are not journeying into a new territory.
Yes.
You're kind of staying in comfort zone land.
Playing not to lose.
Yeah. And that's boring.
Being bold means playing to win, right? And playing to win means you might lose, but you also might win big.
Right.
I think the biggest worry I had about failure, about the topic of failure, other than the irony of failing at writing about failure, was that I think people can be forgiven for thinking they know everything about it already. Now, someone told me recently, and I took it as a compliment, that there's nothing in the book that isn't obvious. and I agree. And I thought that was a big compliment, because I think once you say it, it's not like, nah, that's not true. It's like, it's obviously true. But the problem is people don't think about failure the right way. And then they do all of that holding back that you were just describing.
Yeah. Do you think we don't think about it because we can't openly actually talk about it like we should? Or that's a big generalization.
It depends on what it is. Like you said a couple of minutes ago that, places like Duke and Harvard, we don't, failure, you can't have it there. Well, actually, in every success in academia, in any realm of research, was preceded by many failures. It's the whole idea of academic pursuit is that you're in new territory, that you're making what's called a contribution to some field. And when you're making a contribution, that means it's something new that didn't exist before you made, that piece of knowledge or that piece of certainty about that knowledge didn't exist before. And so along the way to those kinds of results are many missteps or, hypotheses that didn't get supported.
Right. I just remember one time in my career, and there's several, obviously, learnings for myself of like what I was doing and learning. And I was very open about that didn't work. And that actually had a ripple effect on my team, right? Yeah. So they knew it was okay.
They need you to say that stuff.
Yeah, because that leads to psychological safety, which is obviously something you know a lot about as an expert in that. But I think it led to just feeling okay, like permission to fail, but learn from it. Like just don't fail, aimlessly, but fail in a way that it can actually contribute to the next thing.
Exactly. I mean, we don't celebrate failure from just sloppiness or mailing in. It's failing to be bold. It's kind of failure when you go for it and you had good reason to believe it would work, but it didn't, right? And that's okay, right? And not only is it okay, it's part of the process.
Yeah. And then I think it's also how someone receives failures.
Right.
So like as we're working with others and we realize that failure is just part of the process, how can we help others maybe turn that a little bit?
In a way, I mean, maybe this would help. Strategy 101 is you've got to pick and choose. So for instance, I am happy. In fact, I would love to be average at golf, right? I mean, that would be like a huge up from where I am. I'm below mediocre. And yet, does that mean I should just throw away my clubs, sell them on eBay? Of course not. I mean, it's still worth doing, right? It's worth doing. It's worth doing for the little bit of pleasure of getting better. It's worth doing for the lovely walk in a scenic environment. It's worth doing to keep my husband or son's company. I mean, there's all sorts of good reasons to do some things not well.
Yeah.
Either because they give you pleasure or because you're really dedicating yourself to the things that matter for your work, your life's contributions.
Yeah. Sometimes I think we keep trying to like be good at everything, spin every plate the right level. And I don't know, for me, as I got older, and I've realized that I just can't, and it's okay. As simple as that sounds, and that is not it's not rocket science here for anyone listening, but it is this moment of like, okay, I can't do it. Like, for example, I had to put my dissertation on hold while I was writing my book. What I was finding when I was trying to do both is that one is very different writing. the other. This is not academic enough. Well, this
Yeah.
is too academic. I can't do both well. And so it's okay like to accept it. So I think one of the things you talk about, there are three types of failure. So basic, complex, and intelligent. So can you tell the audience a little bit more about those types of
Sure.
failure?
Yeah, and this is, another way to help think. So basic failures are in familiar territory where there is enough knowledge about how to get the result you want. There's enough knowledge and enough ability to get the result you want. Just follow the recipe, you'll get there. The basic failure exists when you make a mistake, or you don't follow the recipe, maybe because you're not paying attention, maybe because you're forgot to read the recipe, what have you. So basic failures by definition are preventable, and they can be small, they can be large, but when we're at our best, we're paying attention, and we can prevent them. And organizations hospitals, for example, can and should be set up in ways to help us prevent nearly all the basic failures that would otherwise come our way. And complex failures are multi-causal. Unfortunately, these are epidemic in hospitals, but they are the undesired results also in familiar territory of a complex set of interacting factors, any one of which on its own would not lead to the failure, but the confluence of the factors. You had a tired nurse, you had a mislabeled drug, you had a dark corner, the sort of the 4 or 5 things that happened at once. You sometimes call it the Swiss cheese model, where the factors just line up and allow an undesired result to come through. Again, we aspire to catch and correct and not let those come through. The third kind, the intelligent failures, are still undesired, but they are the thoughtful foray in new territories that didn't work out the way we had hoped, right? So they're in pursuit of a goal. They're hypothesis driven. You've done your homework. You have good reason to believe it might work. And they are as small as possible, no bigger than they need to be to get the new knowledge that we need. And so those are, of course, classically a formal hypothesis in a laboratory that isn't supported by data is an intelligent failure. Or, in your own life, you go on, a blind date that you had good reason to believe might work and it doesn't. That's an intelligent failure. No big deal, right? More knowledge is good. We move forward toward that life goal.
Yeah. Do you have a particular failure that you cherish so far?
Yeah, I opened the book with my second year research project in the PhD program, which was a hypothesis in a medical context, a hypothesis that was not supported by data, which of course felt devastating at the time. And it was, without going into enormous detail, read the prologue to get the gory details. The fact of my being wrong, or at least of the hypothesis not being supported by data, ended up taking me in a far more interesting research direction than I had been with that first project. So, it's one of those blessing in disguise, or, it's one of those intelligent failures that brought new knowledge that was so much better than the knowledge I had been seeking to produce. And so, even though it feels badly at first, it ends up being really probably the best thing that ever happened to me in a research sense.
Yeah. And that's a vulnerability.
Yeah.
For sure. In the sense of, one, like, you don't want to get in that situation, in your PhD where you don't have your hypothesis backed up by data. You owned it, you kind of stepped into it,
Yep.
You didn't wallow in it, and you're like, okay, onward. Like, what am I doing next?
Now what?
Yeah.
That's always the question. Now what? Not look backwards, but let's look forward and figure out what this means.
Right. And some of it, and I've used this word a lot, but it is this connection between your personal growth, a sense of vulnerability, and then your ability to, whether it's pivot or kind of move forward, like take action, it is all those combined, which help you understand how to use that failure, right? Utilization of the failure is important, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that someone can do based on what you shared in the book? And I want to talk about just a second, the spectrum and the causes of failure, but how do they utilize failure? How do they know that's something I can use as data to inform me versus that one I just need to let it go?
Well, first of all, it's, intelligent failures as I've defined them, and I'm sort of saying these are the heart and soul of discovery and progress in any field. intelligent failures are not they're rarely things that just happen to you, because by definition, they're things that you were testing on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You knew, in a sense, you were experimenting, right? Whether it was a blind date or a formal lab study. And so then the answer to your question becomes, how do you deliberately take more risks? Which of course brings us back to being bold. How do you deliberately take more risks? Well, you don't just, oh, well, I'll take more risks. No, the risks should be thoughtful, right? They should be in pursuit of a goal. You should have done your homework. Right? You have a hypothesis, and they're going to be as small as they can be to be useful going forward. So that becomes the ingredients for good experimental design, are what you're following in your life, right? I mean, if you're not quite sure, whether you should go move to a new city and, restart your life somewhere else, like you might go visit it first, right? Mm-hmm. That's just kind of obvious. But there's so many ways in our life where I think we erroneously think it's all or nothing, rather than think, okay, what could I do to learn more and get a little of the uncertainty reduced?
Right. Yeah, I say there's a continuum of boldness. The lower end is the quiet end, like thinking about something, actually taking a step or doing something that is just an exploration of understanding.
Right.
And it's not on social media. It's not, you don't even need to share it with someone, and it doesn't even have to make any noise at all. Right. It literally can be
a new clothing style. I mean, it could be something just that you're not quite sure is you, but you could experiment with.
Yeah, I'm going to try this out. Oops, that didn't work. Or it's like, oh, it did. And no one even needs to know. Right. Like, you thought that was bold, right?
Right. But who knew? I can wear hot pink. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. I bet you can. So when you think about like taking that, and you have the causes of failure spectrum, which on one end is blameworthy, on the other end is praiseworthy.
Yeah.
So kind of walk the listeners through that to understand the causes.
The purpose of that model, which, as you say, it just sort of identifies a hypothetical set of causes of some consequential failure in your life, in your company. The purpose of the model is really to do one thing, which is to say that, imagine this spectrum, right? From genuinely blameworthy, someone deliberately sabotages something, it's their mischief maker. They deliberately put salt in the sugar jar, right? Then that causes a failure. This is not something, this is not part of science, right? This is just sabotage and or mischief. And then at the very other end of the spectrum is a thoughtful experiment, right? Where I'm trying to make progress in my life, in science, and I try something and it fails, right? And in between is everything from, inattention to inability, am I yet trained in it, to just genuine uncertainty that makes it impossible to get a reliable result every time. But the point, so it just goes gradually from blameworthy to more and more sort of praiseworthy causes of failure. The purpose is simply to make the point that we tend to react to all failure as if it was caused by a blameworthy act. But we don't do a good job of discerning, sort of like, oh, that bad thing happened. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take a careful, thoughtful look at what happened, versus a kind of, okay, who's the culprit? Who did it? Who should we blame? And my argument is that, the lion's share of failures are not caused by blameworthy acts. But when we respond to them as if there's someone or something to blame in there somewhere, we inhibit the very learning processes that we must do to gain the new knowledge that every failure has.
Yeah. And sometimes your failures have a higher impact. Like, obviously the field I'm in, clinical research, like someone could get hurt. Mistakes can't happen.
Well, and I want to make a very careful distinction between mistake and failure. Failure is a broader category. Failure includes mistakes, but a mistake by definition is a deviation from a known practice. We have the knowledge. So yes, so if you're doing a clinical trial, you absolutely want to minimize mistakes to zero, to close to zero. But that does not mean you can make no failures, because failures happen in new territory. And by definition, a clinical trial is new territory.
For sure. Yeah.
You hope that the drug will show efficacy, but it might not. And it's designed to answer that question accurately, right? And so there's no question we will be disappointed when the answer is no, but we have to accept the answer is no because we designed it in such a way. And we won't get a clear answer unless we avoid mistakes, right? So let's avoid mistakes, but let's accept intelligent failures in new territory.
Okay, I love that distinction because I think sometimes people connect them together.
Yeah, they do. And then they say, and then they get confused again, right? Because then they say, yeah, mistakes have to be okay, right? But then, like, wait a minute, what do you mean mistakes are okay? Like, mistakes aren't okay. I mean, we'll all make mistakes, right? That's to err is that's a given. That's the title of chapter 3. But interestingly, especially in healthcare, just because we, the human, will make mistakes does not mean we can't catch and correct them in a timely way, like before real harm is created most of the time. So, but I think when we mix up the two terms, then people get confused because they sort of they're saying, oh yeah, mistakes are fine. But then they think, no, mistakes aren't fine. And they're right. Mistakes aren't fine. Like mistakes are to be avoided through training, through teamwork, through speaking up, all of the things that best practices for complex, uncertain organizations to make sure that we don't cause preventable harm.
Exactly. So one of the things that you write about in the book is that there are barriers to failing well, right? So there's aversion, there's confusion, and there's fear of failure.
Mm-hmm.
So each of these kind of has a tip of how you can counteract it. Like, so when we think of aversion, like what can we do? Confusion and then fear. And some people do actually fear failing because how they were taught or how they think mistakes equal failure and both are bad. Like they're this
fixed mindset, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's just not where you want to live. So how can you help describe some of those barriers and kind of what the counterweight of those would be?
So it's a pretty simple model, but the idea is aversion is sort of the emotional barrier, right? That we just have a kind of instinctive, I don't want to fail. I don't like failure. I don't like failure attached to me. And that one is addressed best by the human cognitive act of reframing, of realizing, yep, stuff happens and I'm okay. I'm still here, right? That sort of, you talk yourself into a healthier response than your instinctive response would be. And I give the example in the book of the odd observed fact that bronze medalists are happier than silver medalists in the Olympics, right? Because the bronze medalists spontaneously frame their bronze as a victory, right? They look to their left and realize I could have missed the podium altogether. I got a medal at the Olympics.
Yeah.
Whereas the silvers are tending to look up and going, I missed the gold. Like I was that close and I missed the gold. So they're unhappy, right? And you could say that the bronze medalist frame is healthier, right? Because it makes them feel better. And the silver medalist too could be like, hey, I medaled, I got that second best medal, right? I didn't get a bronze. I didn't get nothing, but anyway, so we can reframe the things that we sort of instinctively think are catastrophic as disappointing, right? Okay. So that's aversion. Confusion, I say that's what we've been talking about for a little while, which is, when it's hard to really embrace failure in a thoughtful way if you don't have the thoughtful distinctions, right? So if you don't have the distinction between a basic, a complex, and an intelligent failure, then all failure seems bad. It just does, right? Cognitively. And so that's addressed by having this framework. And then the fear, which I really I categorize that as sort of the social fear, more of the, not just that emotional aversion that we talked about, but the reluctance to have other people see me in a negative light, right? So it's about social stigma of failure. And that the antidote there is really about building psychological safety for honest, candid conversations and reality-based conversations about that things will go wrong in an uncertain, complex, interdependent world.
Yeah. And I think social media in a way plays a part in
yes.
In failure, because I don't think there's a lot of posts that I see that talk about, I failed today, I didn't do this well. We talk about being real and being transparent and showing the authentic selves, but I don't see a lot of people actually putting it out there. And I'm not shaming or blaming or
No,
anything like that.
no. Well, the venue, the venue feels to most of us as if it's for, putting your best self forward, right? It's performance. It's not a conversation. And I think that's really important because I think since social media became a phenomenon, we have made the error in thinking of it as if it were relationships. We do make connections for sure, but these aren't relationships in the sense of that genuine, authentic, vulnerable giving and taking that relationships involve in
the in real life type of
real
things.
life. Exactly. These are performances, mini performances, and in the their best spirit of them, like LinkedIn, I think is deliberately a professional venue. And you're hoping to educate. I mean, you're hoping to put forward good ideas that people like, but you're also hoping that they make a difference.
Yeah. And you might fail there too. I mean,
absolutely.
It's the measure too, I think that's important. Like how we measure our failure or I think that's an interesting concept as well. Is there any way that someone can say like, wow, that was a failure that was awesome in the sense of like, I learned from it. And I think maybe that goes back to the types of we talked about, right?
Yes, I mean, it's new territory. You're putting something out there. You haven't put it out before. So it's by definition new. You've thought about it. You believe you're not being sloppy, right? You believe it's useful, and
you're not calling it in, like you said.
Right. Yeah. And you were wrong, and that's okay. Right.
Yeah. One of the things you talk about in the book, and we'll kind of close out here, is really the conflicting failure cultures that in our society. And some of the stuff that I've done from research for my own book was just around risk and risk taking, because I connect that to being bold, and it's absolutely connected to feeling. Women do less of it than men.
Right.
And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are with regard to kind of the failure cultures that are conflicting there, and how we can, as women, fail more and on the intelligent end of the spectrum.
Lee, that's such a great question. And in the last chapter of the book, I have a section called "The Unequal License to Fail," and it's women and people of color and other, in any marginalized communities. It worries me, of course, because so much of the advice, especially on the intelligent failure, is easier for the dominant members of the dominant group to put into place, right? So if you sort of recognize that as an observed phenomenon, then all right, what do we do about it? Well, I think part of the answer is what your work is dedicated to, which is let's help people be bolder. I think the best way to do that is by saying, in fact, pause to consider like what's the worst that could happen. And, so long as the worst that could happen doesn't deal with death
or harm or
or real harm. Exactly. And it's just, embarrassment or what have you. But the upside is potentially great. Gotta go for it. We gotta train ourselves to err on the side of going for it, of playing to win rather than playing not to lose, because you can play not to lose and look like a success, but it's a little bit of a sham, right? And you're taking only safe bets. You're sort of staying in bounds. You're coloring within the lines, and it may look to the world like what a success, but in fact, you're not really going for it, and there's an inner loss there.
Yeah, you're looking for the upside on the inside. And as that's what came to mind for me is like, whether they know it above me, my supervisors, my boss, or my team knows, like, I know what I did was the right thing to try to do, to experiment or to learn. And I know I was true to me. And I think that's the one thing that I would always keep in mind as a leader of the groups that I led at wonderful institutions of like, I know that was the right thing to do at the right time for the right reason. And I can sleep tonight because of it.
Right.
Did it go as well? Did it create harmony? I'm not sure.
Yep.
But
you tried. You went for it. We
went for it, right? And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And when it works, it's just extraordinary. And I think sometimes, I remember having a meeting of like, let's just talk about our extraordinary failures this year. And what I meant by that, like, what did we fail at that we learned that actually levered us 5 steps ahead? Or because of the failure, we became either a close-knit team or closer, because we were all in it. Like we all knew what we were doing. So I think that's something to also think about when we're thinking about failing as, women or marginalized communities or people of color, just making sure that, you can fail in a group. You can fail with someone. You don't have to always fail solo.
Alone. No, it's true. It's true.
So I think sometimes that makes failure even more meaningful.
Absolutely.
Well,
and as you say, then the silver lining part is very loud and clear, because it is that bonding, which is so exciting and rewarding.
Yeah, because I say every idea I have is not a good idea, but it's an idea. Right. So I write it down and I work to explore it. And sometimes they fall off the list, right? But I don't kill it before it grows or nurtures. I had a conversation last week with Dr. Gervais. One of the things he was talking about was like someone, when they're just kind of in that state below the surface, right? They're germinating in a way. Yeah. You don't look at the seed and say, you're failing, you're late, you're not doing what you need to do.
It just hasn't sprouted yet.
You're germinating.
Right.
And sometimes we need that space too.
You don't look at the seed and say you're failing. I love that.
Exactly. So I thought, when it comes to that, I think we all need to also realize sometimes in our lives we might be germinating, like we're coming back, or we're coming back from something that maybe took us down, but that's not a failure in the sense of that's a way that you can actually learn and move forward. So, well, thank you so much for being on the Bold Lounge. All the information about Amy, her books, and The Right Kind of Wrong is below in the episode notes. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Bold Lounge podcast. Through the continuum of bold stories, vulnerability to taking a leap, you will meet more extraordinary people making a positive impact for others through their unique and important story. By highlighting these stories, we hope to inspire others and share the journey of those with a bold mindset. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast and look forward to sharing the next bold journey with you.